Good afternoon. Happy to be here with you all, and thank you for having me. I'm going to give a personal shout out to a very good friend of mine who is family to Jess Prince, who I love. Just to give you a little bit of a background of Ms. Demetria. Demetria McCain serves as the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity at the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, which we all know as HUD. At FHEO, McCain assists HUD's efforts to eliminate housing discrimination, promote economic opportunity, and achieve diverse, inclusive communities. McCain joins HUD following 15 years of service with 5 as presidents at the Inclusive Community Projects at Dallas, Texas-based affordable fair housing nonprofit. Prior to becoming president, she oversaw operations, communications, and ICP's Mobility Assistance Program, a housing mobility program that helps housing choice vouchers holders exercise their fair housing rights. Conceived by Demetria, ICP's Voice for Opportunity initiative has provided advocacy training to low-income renters and neighboring groups of color. Before joining ICP, McCain worked on USDA Sections 515 rural multifamily housing matters at the National Housing Law. She was also a staff attorney for the Neighboring Legal Service Program of Washington, D.C., assigned to the Southeast Office, where her portfolio primarily included landlord-tenant matters for low-income renters in private and public housing. She has taught as an adjudicated instructor a fair housing and homeless course to undergraduate Copian State University students. McCain brings dual vantage points to FHEO after having spent years assisting both housing choice voucher holders who sought low poverty, well-resourced housing options, and neighborhood groups in underserved communities of color who sought more equitable distribution of resources and services. McCain has sat on several local and national nonprofit boards as a sought-after panelist and commentator on affordable fair housing and the impacts of residential segregation. She is a graduate of Howard University School of Law, New York University, and Brooklyn College, and a member of the Dallas alumni chapter of Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, Inc. I'm gonna say something that is very personal to me. I've been very blessed. This October will be 20 years that I've been able to service Southeast Texas, working for the previous state representative, Joe Desautels, and I think all of us here know the impact of what it is to not have housing. We all know someone in here who has been affected by a housing freeze. We all know what it is to not have a place to stay. We know what it is when someone has to sleep on a couch because they cannot get a voucher because there is a freeze. And it is vitally important to remember that there are people that unfortunately, because of their gender, because of their race or their ethnicity, that they have trouble getting people to listen to them and understanding that there are differences in how we get housing. It has nothing to do with one person being wrong or one person being bad, but it has everything to do with the fact that government has everything to do with making people's lives better. And Ms. Demetria, I'm honored to have you here, especially in a community that continues to battle hurricanes and natural disasters. And before I get up here, I just want to say, if we can all just take a moment to give her a salute, because I want you all to remember, because of people like her, we're able to continue to have that fight to explain to people what it means that we want to live here, we want to work here, we want to raise our families here, and someone like her is allowing us to be able to live here and to continue to grow our area and not have to feel as though we are forgotten, that we are lost, because whether people want to realize it or not, we are considered rural suburban. Her efforts are allowing us to be able to have that. While it is not perfect, we have not been forgotten because of people like her. And I personally thank you giving me the resources as a former staffer and as a legislator to be able to continue to advocate and know that that change is coming. And I personally thank you for taking the time for coming to my hometown, because there are many people in this room who I would not be here without, and I adore so many of them, and there are so many people who this and your work is going to continue to help. And one of my very good friends is here from the family domestic violence area, and I want to also say thank you to the families and the women and the children who you are helping to be able to escape those kinds of situations. And I'm honored to be able to meet you and have you here. So can we please give her a round of applause as she comes up? Thank you so much.
I am truly humbled because, first of all, I have an opportunity to work with, I'm a political appointee, right? So I've only been at HUD 2.5 years, but I have an opportunity to work with a career staff in the HUD Fair Housing Office that is there no matter what administration exists. And so for the HUD career staff folks, please stand up, please stand up. These are the folks who are there in the thick of it, day in and day out. And so thank you very much for your wonderful, endearing words, very touching words. And I am very grateful to have an opportunity to be an appointee under the Biden-Harris administration. But I am truly, truly happy that I had the incredible opportunity to work under the leadership of former Secretary Marcia L. Fudge. She gave us priorities and directives that has set us on our path. And we're now working under Acting Secretary Adrian Todman, and we're promising to continue to do this very important work that was referenced a little bit earlier. So thank you for those words, and just thank you for everything you all do day in and day out with residents of our great country that we're trying to make better. So Beaumont, where's Beaumont? Raise your hand, Beaumont. Beaumont, energy capital, Lamar University, right? But I learned a little bit else about Beaumont. I learned that it was mentioned earlier in the bio that I finished from Howard University School of Law, but I learned that Beaumont was the home of Mr. Willard and Mr. Johns. Do you know Mr. Willard and Mr. Johns, folks? Attorney Willard and Attorney Johns, incredible attorneys from Beaumont that actually worked really hard on segregation and discrimination issues in public spaces. And you guys have had the foresight to actually create a bust in their honor. I didn't get a chance to see it. Maybe I'll get to see it at some point, maybe tonight. But thank you, Beaumont, for having me. But I'm a little upset. Where's Jess and everybody? I'm a little upset that last week, you guys, last week was crawfish week or something that I heard, but you brought me this week. I don't understand this. I want to get my crawfish. I am from Texas, you know. I'm from North Texas. We don't get it up there like y'all do here. Where are my Port Arthur folks? All right, Port Arthur. I had a great time last night at the lovely reception in Port Arthur. Thank you very much for sponsoring that. I had an opportunity to meet your mayor last night. That was absolutely wonderful. And I know you guys are resilient. You have been through a lot, through storms, even recent storms. The climate issues are just getting bigger and bigger. And last year, you celebrated your 125th anniversary. Is that right? Congratulations to you, Port Arthur. You're making it through the storms. And you, as well, just like in Beaumont, had the audacity to create a marker in Port Arthur recognizing where that port was, where enslaved Africans were brought, even after it was illegal to bring enslaved peoples across the shores. So I really want to give yourselves a hand for doing that. It's important for us to remember history. History is so important. Now, our HUD staff, my Region 6 staff, you know, they really grilled you guys on this session, didn't they? Lots of conversation, lots of questions. They really grilled you guys. But I'm going to amplify some of the things that they said and maybe add a little more context. Because as much as Port Arthur and Beaumont understand the importance of history, let's understand even more the nuances of our fair housing history, okay? Is that all right? So let's go back. Let's go back actually to the 19th century. Let's do that. 1866. In 1866, it was on paper made illegal to discriminate in real estate transactions. 1866. Now, what happened right before 1866? Anybody? Where are my history buffs? Emancipation Proclamation. So right after Emancipation Proclamation, it became written there should not be any discrimination in housing transactions, real estate transactions based on race. But we know what happened in reality, right? That was really just honored in the breach, right? So let's move forward. Then we have case law, right? Lots of cases. I could name them off to you, but instead of naming the cases, let me name this one play. Play is called A Raisin in the Sun. Raise your hand if you ever heard of it, right? Right, Lorraine Hansberry wrote that. And Lorraine Hansberry wrote that play not in the abstract. It was an actual situation that her father found himself in when they were trying to buy a house and they were discriminated against, right? And so back in the 1950s when that play was arising, we had all kinds of case law, again, saying that housing discrimination is illegal, right? 1950s. Let's fast forward. Then we get on, there's some folks kind of like you in Chicago just having a horrible experience with housing, right? They're living in slum housing, they're segregated from the rest of the city's services, they can't live certain places, they're taken to the streets and trying to advocate, and they're not getting anywhere. So what do? They called a preacher. I heard there was a preacher in the house. Where's our preacher? Okay, they called a preacher. You're shy. How many preachers are shy? Oh, you're eating. Okay, I'm sorry. So the people in Chicago called a preacher, right? And they said, preacher, pastor, please come to Chicago, help us with this. And that preacher was none other than the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. And so what he did was, we know him for bus boycotts and things of that nature. We know him for voting rights. But people don't really know him for fair housing, right? Do you understand that this pastor took his children and his wife and they up and moved to Chicago so that they could personally experience the travesties that those advocates and housing folks were going through, right? So he actually lived there. And so as was said earlier by my colleague, fast forward, he couldn't get the Fair Housing Act passed in his lifetime. April 4th, 1968. He's assassinated, right? It didn't happen. It didn't happen under his watch. So, next thing you know, I don't know if folks here were old enough to live through that period of time. Next thing you know, cities all over the country, there were uprisings after his assassination, right? To quell some of those uprisings, President Johnson from Texas, right? President Johnson leveraged the moment, finally got Congress, because you heard earlier how it took him forever to try to get there, finally leveraged that moment, got Congress to finally pass the Fair Housing Act of 1968, and that was done 7 days after his assassination. So let's be honest. You had advocates, right? You had a very prominent leader, and then you had something as tragic as an assassination. But yet, on the books, it's been on the books since 1866, right? And so understand that there's something about living with people that really makes people uncomfortable, at least it used to, right? Because if you look at this room, you're extremely diverse. So not to say that there's no issues with the employment law kind of situations, but when we talk about fair housing, kind of a different story. And what I want to say here too is, it was mentioned earlier that you've learned about the 7 protected classes, right? You've learned about transactions that may violate the Fair Housing Act, but I just want to further highlight a piece of that legislation that's often forgotten, and that's the affirmatively furthering fair housing aspect of the Fair Housing Act, right? And so that piece says the Secretary of HUD shall administer its programs and activities relating to housing and urban development in a manner that affirmatively furthers fair housing. That's a lot of words, right? But let me say that affirmatively furthering fair housing is more than just not discriminating, right? You can't say, I'm a city, I don't discriminate, I'm good. You can't say, I'm a housing agency, I don't discriminate, I'm good. No, it's actually taking steps, that word affirmative, right? Take a look at what's happened, right? You got some issues going on? Do something about it, right? So that's what that's about. And in 2021, under the Biden-Harris administration, through HUD, we actually reinvigorated that certification that when entities and program participants receive our funding, they're certifying that they will affirmatively further for housing. And that's something that we did about 6 or 7 months after this administration took to office. So I just want to lift that up for you. But yes, I am with Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. We have that 3-part mission to eliminate housing discrimination, to promote economic opportunity, and try to achieve diverse, inclusive communities. In addition to the Fair Housing Act, you guys touched on some of our other authorities earlier today. There's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, right? So the Fair Housing Act of 1968, there's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which talks about federal programs should not discriminate, or anything that's touching federal money should not discriminate based on national origin or race, right? And then you heard about all of the 7 protected classes under the Fair Housing Act. There's also the Rehabilitation Act of 1973. We just celebrated the 50th anniversary last year. That's critically important as it relates to disability rights. We've got disability rights under the Fair Housing Act, but we also have it under the Rehabilitation Act as well. And so we've got lots of authorities that we work under. And offices like Christina's office around the country, we have 10 regions take these types of complaints. In fiscal 2023, we actually, along with our FAPs, and I'll tell you what that is in a second, we handled 8,200 complaints that came in the door. I say the door, use it loosely, email, online, et cetera, 8,200. Of the 8,200, the one that ranks where we get the most complaints based on the 7 protected classes and based on retaliation is disability, right? And our next to highest is race, right? And so it goes down like that. Retaliation definitely comes in there, and you heard about what retaliation is a little earlier. The one that we hear the least about is religion. But if you've been reading the newspaper or looking online, we know that there's a lot of hate going on based on religion, right? And so the Biden-Harris administration has actually convened an interagency working group to focus on these types of issues, which is why just not too long ago, I released a memo to our staff as well as our fair housing partners regarding keep a lookout, right? Keep a lookout. There's a lot of anti-Semitism, there's a lot of Islamophobia out there, but let's keep a lookout on religious discrimination, because come on, let's be honest. Everybody who has a fair housing problem is not picking up the phone calling HUD, right? Especially if you're in a crisis and you need housing. I don't have time for this like 1-year process or whatever it is, right? I need my housing right now. But we wanted to make sure that we keep an eye out on that type of religious discrimination that's taking place. So let's just talk a little bit about some of those cases that we handle. Let's focus on home ownership first. You heard some statistics earlier. You heard the statistics about the wealth gap, right, race-wise. You heard the 8 times, 5 times based on Black and Latinx families versus white families of wealth. And how do people usually acquire wealth? Home ownership, right? All right, Miss Real Estate person. Home ownership. But guess what? The Black-white home ownership gap is greater now than it was when the Fair Housing Act was passed. Now, what year did I say the Fair Housing Act was passed? 1968. And so we've got some serious issues. So please understand that when people contact our office to file complaints, we are actually looking at some issues related to fair lending. There are other offices, federal offices, that deal with fair lending as well as ours, but we do handle fair lending issues through our office as well. And let's talk about what was touched on a little earlier by our realtor in the room, which is appraisal bias. So now if you are going to buy a house, you're going to hope that it's going to help with your wealth issue, right? And so maybe you want to borrow against it to send your kids to school, to pay for something or whatever. But if your home is appraised at a level lower than you think it should be, you're not going to get that wealth out of that home, right? You're not going to get the money out of that home that way. And so that's why President Biden created the PAVE, we call it PAVE, P-A-V-E, the Property Appraisal Valuation Equity Task Force. It's a 13-agency task force, not just HUD, 13-agency task force to look at this issue. Now, if you're looking at me with like a deer in headlights, let me tell you what this is. So there are several families who filed complaints with us on this issue. So some families actually had to whitewash their homes, meaning they knew the appraisal came in too low. So they got their buddies, they got a white buddy of theirs, a neighbor or a friend, and I know you took that little quiz earlier about how if your friends look like you or not. So if you had a friend that didn't look like you, right, let's say you were Latinx or black, and you had a white friend, you brought your white friend in, you took all your hair care products out of the house, you took your pictures of your family out of the house, you whitewashed your home, brought your white friend in to pretend that they were the homeowner, and boom, it was appraised higher. That's what we're talking about. This is not made up. This is not fictional. This is happening around the country, right? And so that's why we're actually, HUD is leading the work of these 13 agencies. And this task force, PAVE task force, has dedicated itself to have some outcomes, right? And so there have been several hearings through the appraisal subcommittee. There's been some data sharing that didn't previously exist so that we can have some more transparency. Academics have used that data to try to do some more studies because it's data, right? Let's just not base things on subjective thoughts, right? Because we have what? Implicit bias, right? And so that's taking place. So data has become more transparent, and we've been able to use the data as we investigate some of these cases. And the industry, folks, let's talk about the industry. The percentage of appraisers who are white is over 80%, okay? And so there's some work going on to diversify that particular industry. In Mississippi, they actually created a program, and they actually created a whole pool of diverse appraisers. And so that's another piece that it's important for community to come around some of these issues because the federal government can't do it alone. Right? And so that's something in the home ownership realm. Let's talk about rental housing. I see a lot of our housing agencies here, public housing agencies here. Let's talk about rental housing. What kind of cases have we taken in rental housing? Some of the stuff make you want to cry, or as Marvin Gaye would say, make you want to holler. We've had, as was mentioned earlier, the 7 protected classes include sex, and sex includes gender identity and sexual orientation. We've seen landlords go after their tenants and said, hey, I need you to dress like a man, walk like a man, talk like a man. So we've resolved those types of cases under the sex aspect, gender aspect of the Fair Housing Act. Had another case just up the road in Plano, Texas, where someone was advertising a rental unit. A young black woman who just finished college came in and he was like, heck no, not you, based on race. And then placed an ad, I think it was Craigslist, I believe, discriminatory ad, and then made discriminatory statements. And then, once she tried to pursue her fair housing rights, retaliated against her, all right? This sounds like some old 1950s stuff, but it's happening right now. We're getting these cases, folks. And if you don't know, tell your folks, it doesn't cost a thing to file cases with us. It just causes Christine and her staff more work. But that's why they're there and they love it, right? That's why they're there. Let's talk a little bit then about something that a lot of people, I know my housing agencies are keyed into this, source of income discrimination. Source of income discrimination is not explicitly part of the Fair Housing Act. So right now we have landlords across the country that say, I don't want to rent to you because I don't want to take this Section 8 voucher, right? But if there is a nexus sometimes there is a nexus to source of income discrimination, meaning they don't want to rent to them because they don't want to use the Section 8 voucher as part of the rent. If there is a nexus between the source of income discrimination and discrimination under the Fair Housing Act, then somebody could get in trouble for that. So we're paying close attention to that. And very recently, I released a memo to our Fair Housing Assistance Programs. You guys have one here. It's called a FAP. They take fair housing cases that we send to them. It's in your Texas Workforce Commission. It's embedded in the Texas Workforce Commission. So that's your fair housing agency for the state. And some localities have it too. I know City of Dallas has one as well, their own FAP agency. But I've sent it to that memo to the FAPs to say, hey, you can use our money if you think you want to do some testing on source of income discrimination, if you think there may be a nexus with some type of violation under the Fair Housing Act. Same thing goes for our FIPS, which more or less are the nonprofit partners that we give funding to. Ms. Cortez mentioned that she receives our funding. That's a type of a FIP, so to say. So some of our FIPS actually do testing. Do people know what testing is? Raise your hand if you don't. Don't be shy. Okay, thank you. Testing is when you kind of send, it's like secret shopper, so to say, right? And so you may create two characters who are exactly the same, except one thing differs. Maybe one has a disability and one doesn't. You send them in to see if they're treated the same. Maybe one is of one national origin and one is of another. You send them in to see if they're treated the same or treated differently. And that gives us a clue as to whether or not that housing provider should be looked at more closely, okay? Whether there's some kind of discrimination there. And so also our Public and Indian Housing Office, not my office, but the Public and Indian Housing Office has recently created a website about source of income discrimination, just to help people understand what it is and what have you. So if you're not aware of that, my public housing agencies, send your folks to that website so they can better understand that. That's something that came about, I think, just about a month ago. So that's key. Also, it was hinted earlier. Where's my domestic violence team? Somewhere over here? All right. VAWA, Violence Against Women's Act. It's been around for a few years, but it was reauthorized in 2022. Violence Against Women Act protects people from domestic violence, dating violence, stalking, sexual assault. But what's significant about this 22 version, update I should say, is that people who are survivors now have the same procedural rights to file a complaint as people do under the Fair Housing Act. So if there's a violation of the VAWA Act, they come to our office, FHEO, and file a complaint. Why would they file a complaint? It could be something to the extent of maybe they need an emergency transfer. Oh, you heard emergency transfer earlier, didn't you, today? Maybe they need an emergency transfer because of the situation that they're in, right? But that federally funded or HUD-funded entity did not give them that emergency transfer when they could have given them that emergency transfer. So that's the situation where they would file a complaint with our office. And so actually, this is a new muscle for us, and it's taken a lot for us to kind of get to the place where we can handle these cases, to be honest with you, and we're still trying to get even cleaner on it. But since October 1st, 2022, we've actually handled at least 200 of these cases. And so more and more are coming in. And so survivors are experiencing these problems at an enormous rate. Think about this. Let's say you are a survivor of domestic violence, right? And your partner, husband, boyfriend, whomever, who was living with you, is now no longer in the home. But the lease was under that person's name. And now you're being kicked out, you and your kids. Where are you going to go, right? And so this is an opportunity to say, hold up. I am not the person who caused all this havoc. I actually am the survivor. And so please, let's switch this out and allow my family to stay here, right? So that's just an example. But VAWA is new, fairly new and critically important, and I'm sure these folks are experts here in VAWA. So let's give a hand to the folks who are working on these really tough issues. I mean, it's really hard. Our staff is having to hear some real hard stories, folks. And to have that survivor to have to explain again and again what happened. This is some critical work, because you said what, housing is critical. And if you got some kids too, that's a whole nother story. Let's talk about community issues that we've taken. Well, Jefferson County. Raise your hand if you know something about Jefferson County. Raise your hand. My, Jefferson County. If you didn't know, maybe you do. Back in May 2022, our office actually took on the general land office of the state as it relates to the CDBG Harvey mitigation funding. And we found some problems, not under the Fair Housing Act, but under Title VI, as well as under the Housing and Community Development Act. We actually ended up issuing a letter of determination finding that they discriminated. Counties like Jefferson County, Harris County, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, Nueces, there's another one. Nueces counties actually, in our letter of determination, were some of the counties that were, let me just use the shorthand of it, that perhaps did not benefit from that competition because of what we saw as violations of Title VI. And Title VI, again, as I mentioned earlier, relates to race and national origin. And so while we made that letter of determination on Title VI, we are currently investigating the case under also the Fair Housing Act. So sometimes we can use more than one of our authorities to try to make sure that things are properly distributed. So that's some of the community work that we've done, folks. In Chicago, very, very proud of this. I don't think in any recent memory of anybody at HUD have they seen the type of environmental justice work that our team has done since I've been here. And so in Chicago, there were 3 groups who came together, community groups, churches, pastors, came together and filed a complaint against the city of Chicago. City of Chicago, there was a plant in a white neighborhood, and they were moving it over to the Black and Latinx neighborhood that already had tons of factories and plants. And so that complaint was filed with us. We worked it up, we investigated it. We were actually able to resolve that case with the city of Chicago. And in resolving that case, the city of Chicago agreed to do several things, but I'll just name a couple of them. One of the things was they're going to do a comprehensive health study to look at the social factors, environmental factors of the community, and they are to use, under our conciliation agreement, they are to use that study when they're making future permitting and types of zoning types of decisions as it relates to these kinds of activities. And so we're very proud of that resolution. It was not an easy process, but we did finally get there, and the city did agree to the voluntary conciliation agreement. But that was brought by people in the community, folks. Another thing, example is Atlanta Housing Authority. We came to a resolution with them, and they agreed that they would start doing a better job of monitoring their reasonable accommodation requests. I know you heard a little bit earlier about reasonable accommodations, but they decided that, yes, okay, we're going to come into an agreement with you, HUD, and we're going to do better, right? And so those reasonable accommodation requests are very, very serious. I said earlier that of the 8,200 cases, the biggest one we see happens to be on the issues of disability, but the work that I'm talking about now is really some of our compliance work. And so Christina gave you an idea of how sometimes her office could come in and take a look at some compliance types of issues. City of Dallas Housing Authority, you know, I'm from Dallas, so I'm not proud of this, but City of Dallas Housing Authority, we came to an agreement with them about a year or two ago on issues of reasonable accommodation. Folks, this is a situation where a woman actually was crawling up the stairs on a regular basis to get to her unit because she could not get transferred to a unit that would accommodate her disability, okay? Visualize that for me, please. Visualize that. So addition to that, we're also doing some proactive stuff because we don't want people to be respondents in these cases. We have complainants, we have respondents. We don't want people to be respondents, so we're providing technical assistance to folks. We have created several toolkits. We have a Fair Housing Disaster Toolkit to help people prepare for disasters and make sure things are done equitably and in alignment with civil rights laws. We have a fair housing planning toolkit for cities, counties, states who want to do some fair housing planning. Very proud of that work that that team at our headquarters office did recently. We have an LGBTQI+ toolkit, because a lot of people are new to these types of issues. That toolkit would help you understand some of the issues and nuances as it relates to sex discrimination, right? And so that's some of the work that we're doing as it relates to community. I talked about VAWA already. Let me talk about some of the other recent things we did, get away from the cases per se. We recently, last March, gave out $30 million to our FIP program partners around the country. Our FIPs, like I said, Ms. Cortez is one of our FIP folks. Congratulations. So we have different type of FIPs around the country, and we can't do this work without them. So that's where you send your folks to say, hey, you got a problem, I can't help you with it, but go talk to this agency over there, and they can help counsel them through and maybe lead them through the process of filing a complaint with HUD. We also issued some marketing guidance that's helpful, particularly people who handle HUD subsidized housing. Because we actually, in the Bronx, we had a case where our folks, our team looked at the demographics of this place. It was a HUD subsidized complex. The Bronx, New York folks, if you in the Bronx, New York, how is it you don't have any Asians, black people, Latinx people living in this complex, right? Didn't really pass the sniff test. So our folks looked into that case and found out there were some issues there. That case was resolved, but our team also created some marketing guidance for HUD subsidized folks on issues like that. We did the disparate impact rule. What is disparate impact, folks might say? Disparate impact is a tool of the Fair Housing Act, right? And so let me just say that discrimination can be overt, where you can see it easily. It can also be covert. And there could also be some policies that seem neutral that actually have a discriminatory effect on a whole group of folks who fall under one of those 7 protected classes. And so we were very proud that we reissued our discriminatory impact rule. That's something that we've done as well. One of the priorities of the Biden-Harris administration was for us to get that done, and we got it done. It was mentioned earlier that we currently have a proposed rule on issues of let me get the title right, reducing barriers to HUD-assisted housing. So that's open for public comment. Public comments will close June 10th. So is anybody, we want to hear from everybody, all corners of the world on this. We want to hear from everybody about what they think about our draft rule, right? And that draft rule relates to the extent that people who have some type of criminal background could maybe have those barriers pushed back so they could qualify for some of our HUD housing. So take a look at that, please. All these things, just go to our website and you'll find it. Forthcoming, as I kind of come to an end here, forthcoming is our Section 504 rule. Raise your hand if you know what Section 504 relates to. Anybody? Call it out. What does it have to do with? Anybody? Section 504, I can't hear you. Disability, right, I heard, that's right. Listen, I talked earlier about how Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act had its 50th anniversary last year. Guess what? It has some regulations. Those regulations have not been updated since 1988, right? So technology has changed, things have changed, and so please look for that. We're going to be updating that rule. We want your input, right? And that's critically important, particularly as it relates to our folks who are otherwise abled, right? Section 504 is big, folks. It's really big, and anybody with federal assistance attached should be paying attention to Section 504 and disability issues, not just under the Fair Housing Act, but also under that particular act as well. Also forthcoming, how many people have been reading about artificial intelligence? It's all over the news. I'm so tired of hearing every article. But seriously, the Biden-Harris administration issued an executive order as it relates to artificial intelligence, and they've charged HUD to actually issue some guidance as it relates to tenant screening, right? Because a lot of people are using different types of tenant screening. So we're going to be issuing some guidance on tenant screening, whether or not you're using artificial intelligence or not. There's a piece going to be in there about artificial intelligence, but that's critically important because we want to make sure that people who do tenant screening, I know we've got some property managers in the room and what have you, understand what your responsibilities are under the Fair Housing Act as it relates to those kind of things. Also, as it relates to marketing, right? We had a big case a while ago with Facebook that we resolved, right? Because there was some marketing going on that actually did not align with fair housing issues, okay? So marketing is really important too. Even our banks and stuff should be paying attention as it relates to that kind of stuff. And also, I want to say that we've got a lot going on. We got a lot going on, a lot going on. But we can't do this without you folks. This year's theme at HUD for Fair Housing Month is putting the act into action, right? Let's turn Fair Housing Act, which is a noun, let's turn it into a verb, right? Because we want to act. Federal government cannot do this alone. Yes, the federal government, yes, local government, yes, state government created a whole bunch of problems way back when that we're still living through. And it's going to take some intentionality to change that, right? If we were intentional back in the 1930s when we were redlining, intentional back in the 50s, intentional back in the 60s, we've got to be intentional now to undo that and lift that burden from people, right? We need social workers. We need pastors. We need housing providers. We need realtors. We need students. We need residents. We need people with lived experience who know what's going on to them, right? And this administration is critical about hearing from people with the lived experience. And I say lived expertise. We need all these people to come with us so that we can put the action into the act and actually make Fair Housing Act a verb. Will you help me do that? Thank you very much.